In Washington, under the bright lights of a defense policy briefing, US Vice President J.D. Vance stepped to the podium with a message that immediately stirred global attention. Calm, measured, but unmistakably assertive, Vance defended one of the most controversial moves in American security policy in years, the planned resumption of nuclear weapons tests. His words were simple, direct, and deliberate. Sometimes you have to test it to make sure it works and functions properly. For months, rumors had circulated in defense circles about renewed nuclear testing, something the United States had largely avoided for decades. But now, standing before cameras and correspondents, Vance confirmed what many had feared and others had quietly expected, that America may soon return to underground testing, a move with profound political, scientific, and strategic consequences. He spoke not with the hesitation of a man unveiling a secret, but with the conviction of a policymaker who saw the decision as necessary, not optional. We have a large arsenal, he said. Obviously, the Russians also have a large nuclear arsenal, as do the Chinese. Sometimes you have to test it to make sure it works. It was a phrase that echoed through the halls of Washington and across the global press. Within minutes, news outlets from Tokyo to Berlin began flashing the headline, US Vice President defends nuclear tests. But behind that line lies a complex reality, a debate about deterrence, maintenance, and the limits of trust in a world where the weapons of the Cold War still hang over humanity like a shadow. In the days that followed, the White House clarified that these would not necessarily be live-yield detonations, but rather subcritical tests designed to validate the reliability of aging warheads. Still, the announcement raised eyebrows at the United Nations, where diplomats had spent decades trying to prevent precisely this moment, a return to testing that could unravel the fragile web of nuclear restraint. Inside the National Security Council, advisers described the move as strategic maintenance, not escalation. But in Moscow and Beijing, the interpretation was different. Russian state television called it a provocation disguised as safety assurance. Chinese officials accused Washington of weaponizing fear to maintain dominance. For Vance, the rationale was clear. America's nuclear deterrent, he said, must not be taken for granted. Every missile, every warhead, every component must be verified, maintained, and, if necessary, tested to ensure functionality. He framed it not as aggression, but as prudence, the quiet discipline of a nation that cannot afford failure in its most consequential domain. He continued, we work very closely together, even with nations with whom we don't have the best relationship, to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The president will continue to advocate for this, but it's a critical part of US national security to ensure that our nuclear arsenal actually functions properly. The subtext was unmistakable. America was not stepping back from arms control, but it was reminding the world that its deterrent still mattered. Behind Vance's remarks, the context was rapidly taking shape. Over the past year, reports from the Pentagon's Strategic Capabilities Office had warned of potential reliability gaps in some aging components of the US nuclear stockpile. The data didn't indicate imminent failure, but it raised enough concern to justify additional verification. At the same time, intelligence assessments suggested that both Russia and China had been conducting low-yield or subcritical tests at their own facilities, activities that skirted but did not technically violate the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. In that environment, the United States decision appeared as much a response as an initiative, a declaration that it would not allow rivals to advance unchecked. Analysts noted that the announcement came just weeks after satellite imagery showed renewed activity at Russia's Novaya Zemlya testing grounds and China's Lopnur site. Still, critics at home were not convinced. Senator Elizabeth Warren, a longtime advocate of non-proliferation, warned that even a symbolic return to nuclear testing sends the wrong signal to the world. Former defense officials argued that modern computational models and non-explosive verification techniques were sufficient to maintain confidence in America's arsenal. But Vance, in his characteristic plain-spoken style, pushed back. To be clear, he said, we know it works properly, but you have to keep an eye on it over time, and the president just wants to make sure we do that. It was an argument grounded in realism and in the political reality of the moment. With rising tensions in Eastern Europe and the Pacific, Washington's leadership sought to project not recklessness, but readiness. And for many in the defense establishment, Vance's remarks signaled a broader strategic recalibration, a reminder that deterrence still depends on credibility, and credibility, in turn, depends on proof. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, classified discussions had taken place at the Nevada National Security Site, formerly known as the Nevada Test Site, the same desert where the United States conducted more than 1,000 nuclear tests during the Cold War. Engineers there, according to defense insiders, had prepared contingency plans for subcritical experiments, controlled implosions using fissile materials that would stop short of triggering a chain reaction. Such tests, they argued, could yield valuable data on the behavior of aging plutonium cores and high explosive triggers without breaching the test ban. For the average American, such technical nuance may seem distant, but for those charged with safeguarding the nation's deterrent, it represents the fine line between confidence and uncertainty, between an arsenal that merely exists and one that truly works. As Vance spoke, images of mushroom clouds from the 1950s flashed across television screens, haunting reminders of an era when nuclear explosions were a routine spectacle. The difference today, officials insisted, was purpose and precision. This was not about power projection or intimidation. It was about verification, ensuring that weapons built decades ago could still perform if, heaven forbid, they were ever needed. Yet the symbolism was unavoidable. For countries like Iran and North Korea, both under heavy scrutiny for their nuclear ambitions, Washington's move could be used to justify their own testing or enrichment activities. Diplomats at the United Nations warned of reciprocal escalation, where one test justifies another and restraint slowly erodes. Still, within the Pentagon, the calculus was strategic. The Department of Defense had concluded that maintaining the credibility of America's deterrent required not just modernization through programs like the Sentinel Intercontinental Ballistic Missile and the Columbia-class submarine, but also ongoing verification of warhead reliability. The testing debate was, in many ways, the last piece of that puzzle. Experts in nuclear policy pointed out that since the United States last conducted a full-scale nuclear test in 1992, it has relied on simulation, high-energy physics, and advanced computing to certify its arsenal. That approach, known as the Stockpile Stewardship Program, has been widely regarded as a success. But some engineers caution that as materials age beyond their original design life, small deviations could accumulate. And while the probability of malfunction remains low, the consequences of failure are too catastrophic to ignore. That is the logic behind what Vance called keeping an eye on it over time. From a political standpoint, his comments also fit into a broader pattern. The Biden administration, with Vance as its most vocal security advocate, has tried to strike a balance between deterrence and diplomacy. On one hand, it continues arms control dialogue with Moscow and strategic stability talks with Beijing. On the other, it invests heavily in modernization of the nuclear triad. The message is clear: dialogue is desirable, but deterrence is non-negotiable. For allies, the message landed with mixed emotions. In Europe, NATO officials privately welcomed the renewed emphasis on reliability. In Japan and South Korea, however, where anti-nuclear sentiment remains strong, the news reignited public debate about double standards, why some nations contest in the name of security while others are sanctioned for it. Inside Washington, meanwhile, Vance's remarks reignited the long-dormant debate over the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty itself. Though signed by the United States in 1996, the treaty has never been ratified by the Senate. Critics argue that resuming tests, even subcritical ones, undermines its spirit. Supporters say the treaty's verification mechanisms were never strong enough to prevent clandestine tests by adversaries in the first place. In the days following the announcement, the Energy Department's National Nuclear Security Administration issued a brief statement confirming that preparations were underway for a technical validation series, a sequence of subcritical experiments expected to begin early next year. Officials emphasized that no yield or radiation release would occur, yet the terminology itself, that series, validation, containment, carried the unmistakable cadence of the nuclear age returning to consciousness. Back on Capitol Hill, senators lined up to respond. Some hailed the decision as overdue. Others warned that it risked triggering a new arms race. The Congressional Budget Office projected that the broader nuclear modernization program, including testing infrastructure, could exceed $1.7 trillion over 30 years. For critics, that raised uncomfortable questions about cost, necessity, and moral direction. But for Vance, the argument was not about cost. It was about confidence and deterrence, which, as he reminded reporters, depends not on promises, but on proof. The president just wants to make sure we do that, he said, closing his remarks with the tone of finality that defines Washington policy when decisions are made. In the following days, the story travelled beyond the Beltway. In Nevada, local communities near the historic testing grounds expressed concern about safety and transparency. Tribal leaders, environmental groups, and veterans of past test-era cleanup campaigns called for open hearings and environmental assessments before any new activities proceed. The Department of Energy promised full compliance with environmental law and said any experiments would occur hundreds of meters underground in reinforced chambers. Meanwhile, in Geneva, disarmament diplomats convened emergency consultations. The chair of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, Robert Floyd, said he expected clarifications from Washington. European allies urged restraint, fearing that Russia could use the move as a pretext to restart its own testing. Within hours, the Kremlin announced that its forces had conducted a non-nuclear demonstration of strategic readiness, a phrase analysts interpreted as a thinly veiled warning. At home, the American public reacted with a mix of unease and pragmatism. Polls conducted by the Pew Research Center showed that while a majority of Americans still oppose nuclear testing in principle, support rises significantly when the question includes ensuring the safety and reliability of existing weapons. It was a reminder that fear and security often coexist in uneasy balance. As the debate intensified, historians drew parallels to earlier moments when nuclear policy stood at a crossroads: 1949, when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb; 1963, when the Limited Test Ban Treaty sought to halt atmospheric tests; 1992, when President George H.W. Bush declared a moratorium on testing. Each decision reflected a mix of science, politics, and existential anxiety. Today's announcement, they said, was no different. Throughout it all, Vance maintained a steady tone, refusing to frame the move as escalation. Instead, he called it maintenance of deterrence. In interviews following his remarks, he repeated the same core message. America must be absolutely sure its arsenal works because the credibility of its security commitments from NATO to the Pacific depends on it. His approach reflected a broader political evolution. Once known primarily for his cultural conservatism and populist rhetoric, Vance has increasingly positioned himself as a pragmatic security voice within the administration, someone willing to defend unpopular policies if he believes they serve national survival. Supporters see that as courage. Critics call it dangerous pragmatism. But regardless of interpretation, one fact is certain. His words have reignited a debate that had been dormant for nearly a generation. Nuclear testing, once thought to be a relic of the 20th century, is again a topic of 21st century policy discussion. As evening fell over Washington, the cameras dimmed and Vance left the stage. Behind him, the briefing room returned to silence. But outside, the echoes of his words continued to ripple through capitals across the world. In Moscow, state television described the remarks as confirmation of America's aggressive doctrine. In Beijing, foreign ministry spokespeople demanded clarification, warning of serious consequences for global stability. In Paris and London, officials expressed cautious understanding but urged Washington to uphold its obligations under international law. And in Vienna, inspectors prepared for heightened monitoring of global seismic data, just in case. By week's end, the story had shifted from announcement to interpretation. Analysts debated whether the United States was preparing for a real test or merely reinforcing a posture. The difference, they said, was less about physics and more about politics. In a world where perception often shapes policy, even the hint of testing can carry as much impact as the detonation itself. For J.D. Vance, the message remained consistent. America cannot afford complacency. In an era of new hypersonic weapons, cyber threats, and autonomous defense systems, he argued, deterrence must evolve. And that begins with ensuring the foundations are strong. Testing, in his view, is not a return to the past, but a safeguard for the future. Whether that reasoning will prevail in Congress, in diplomacy, or in public opinion remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. The Vice President has reignited one of the most consequential conversations in modern security policy. And as the debate continues, one line from his remarks still captures the essence of his defense. Sometimes you have to test it to make sure it works. That single sentence, delivered in Washington on an autumn afternoon, may shape the course of global nuclear policy for years to come.